All right, our first panel is Human Rights 1, featuring Norah, Celeste, Maya, Lily, Srijan, and Una. So let's give them a round of applause. Yes. This is the first panel. It's very nerve-wracking. Thank you all for going first. We really appreciate it, especially you, Norah. So I'm going to hand you the mic, and that'll be it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Norah. I'm a junior at the University of Pennsylvania. And I will be presenting on my summer trip this summer. I went to Kolkata, India, to look at the largest literary market in the world and also India's oldest literary market called College Street. And let's just say that in India, there's a politics to the book market. So just a little bit of background. I spent 8 weeks in Kolkata, and over the course of my time there, I did around over 20 interviews with different students, booksellers, academics, publishers, and people within the community who had grown up near the street. And these interviews were done both in English and in Bengali. One thing that's really interesting is that even though a lot of the booksellers were selling English books, that didn't necessarily mean that they could speak or read English, which was a very particularly interesting phenomenon that I was able to talk to them about. In addition to my interviews, I also did archival work at local universities, particularly Presidency University, and I was able to go through their archives of student magazines. And then I also had to do plenty of reading on the history and the theory of the space in and of itself to get a sense of understanding how politics and literature have been distinctly tied within India and constructing a sense of national identity. And more than anything, I spent plenty of time on the street at College Street. The street opened up at 10 a.m., closed at 6 p.m. Spent so much time there that even though it was like a bustling street, I knew the booksellers well enough to recognize when they got a haircut. And so these are a little bit of the snippets of my time on College Street. As you can see, this is a space. It's around 700 meters, but filled with over 1,500 bookstalls. And yes, I spent one day counting. And it's an amazing space that was built up around these universities that give the street its name. And one thing I was particularly interested in is that this space itself has been a hub of intellectual movements and thoughts within India's history. But I wanted to know how it's seen change over the past couple of decades due to different extenuating economic and political factors. So I was particularly looking at interviewing people about the history of the street and also understanding what role it plays currently within the cultural landscape. And in addition to my reporting on College Street, this was really purely out of fate. I spent so much time on the archives on campus, I came up with these really great friends, one of whom happened to be working at this museum exhibition that was celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Kolkata Friendship Walk, which is actually the very first Pride March that happened in South Asia. So I was able to go and attend this commemoration event where I got to meet some of the first original, there were 15 people involved in that Pride March, and I got to meet some of those original individuals and talk a little bit about how that history is sort of expanding. So this is a little bit of a tangent to my main project on College Street, but I thought it was a really interesting sort of thing about how one sort of project in journalism can quickly snowball into another, depending on the sources and the people you meet. I will say one of the best parts of my project alongside doing the research was the people that I met. It being a college street in and of itself, a lot of the people I met were around my age, and the people I was interviewing were, of similar interests of me, and we became very, very close, which was a really, really cool perspective that I was able to gain on not only College Street as a place, but also about the community. They were taking me with them to hang out with their friends and also giving me a sense of what it's like to grow up around this cultural touchstone and what it means to them now. For example, if you look at the bottom, girl on the bottom, Artita, her mom went to college on College Street. She went to college on College Street, and she was sort of telling me a little bit about how she conceptualizes of these changes. And so that was definitely a really cool experience getting to connect with people there. I also got to go on plenty of adventures. I was mentioning that I have a singular line in a Bengali film now because of a connection I made actually in order to do my journalistic reporting. Oh, someone helped me out getting a source, and then they needed a line in their film, and I was like, that's sort of the relationships that we cultivated. But let's bring it back to the reporting and the research in and of itself. I want to highlight some main key takeaways I got from my research. So the photo on the right is actually in the middle of a cyclone. I decided to go to the street because I wanted to see if there were booksellers still there. And they were, in fact, still at the street. And I got to talk to them a little bit about the infrastructural decline of the street and how different aspects of, climate change and that are impacting the street economically. And while that doesn't necessarily make it into the main part of my piece, that was a really interesting aspect to learn about. One of the things that I mainly focused on was the way in which the character of the street itself has changed. So this was once a place that was very much centered on intellectual thought, but we're seeing it shift now towards catering towards a more quote unquote popular audience in terms of selling textbooks and pulp fiction. And this is really purely an economic change. It's an economic adaptation as we're seeing across the globe. Book markets in general sort of have to compete against the digital market. But one thing that's really interesting to consider is that a literary theorist who I talked to at the Center for Democratic Studies in India pointed out that at the heart of these textbooks and pulp fiction, you kind of see this emergent conservative core. If you think about intellectual tradition of sort of text, that's sort of more expansive versus the way in which the government is sort of interacting with textbooks and pulp fiction have had this sort of persevering ideology that's a little bit more conservative at its heart. Aside from that, in a more direct way, we're seeing an increase in investment of state-sponsored publishing. Almost every single political party has a state-sponsored publication house. And since 2014, we've seen the National Book Trust, which is the Indian government itself, sort of investment increased rapidly. I actually had an interview with them, and I got to speak to them a little bit about the way in which they're sort of trying to utilize literature as a way of connecting with young people, but also imbue certain values of Indian national identity and that construction of that. And so that's sort of a way in which literature has become part of this larger arsenal that includes cinema, that includes social media. We see those talked about a little bit more directly, but literature is just another part of that. And I guess another sort of note and something I came across within my research was the way in which self-censorship is playing out across all that. So I got a chance to interview a couple of different authors, one of which was a author who was working on children's history books. And she was particularly looking at the way in which she sort of had to censor herself on certain topics that she was talking about, not because she was experiencing direct threats, but rather because of the fear of potential threats. So this is a quote that I thought was really sort of indicative of the way in which the market is changing as a whole. I'm not going to read it aloud just because I realize I'm running short on time. And then just some final pages. So my final piece that I'm publishing is going to be about the politics and the changes of College Street. And then I'm also publishing a separate piece that's focusing more specifically on that one author who I spoke about and her experiences with self-censorship. And then on the 25th anniversary exhibition, I ended up pitching that to a local sort of digital magazine called Dirt Media that I'm publishing for them. And then at my college magazine, I got a chance to write a short little excerpt on Pride in Kolkata, and my field note is about the process of making friends while doing journalism. I had a short little video I wanted to show, but it seems like I've run out of time, so you will have to find it on the Pulitzer Center website.
Hi everyone. I'm Celeste. This is Guyana. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm gonna maybe hold this. I'm gonna try to slide. Okay. I'm gonna try to do multitask here. This is Guyana. It's in South America, but Caribbean in culture. This is Maev. Maev lives in the capital city of Georgetown. She loves to write poetry, watch mango trees grow, and play with her 2 children. Maev is an environmentalist and an LGBTQ rights activist. Guyana is the only country in South America that still has a colonial-era law that criminalizes same-sex intimacy. It's really only focused on men and not really enforced, but it still very much affects people in the LGBTQ community, including queer women like Maev. She can't hold her girlfriend's hand in public. She's gotten kicked out of an apartment for living with her. And because she doesn't like to wear dresses, it's hard to keep a job. There are no workplace protections that prevent discrimination based on sexuality. So Maev started an environmentally friendly landscaping business. The only problem, it is hot in Guyana. When I was there last month, it was the first thing everyone said, that it's the hottest it's ever been. So Maev can't do landscaping as much as she'd like, and it's hard now to buy food for her children. Most of Guyana's population lives along the coastline, and a 160-year-old concrete seawall protects it. In Georgetown, everyone hangs out at the seawall on Sundays. And while soca music plays and people drink Banks beer, the seawall is working hard. One University of Guyana researcher told me, the Atlantic Ocean is always trying to get at us. Guyana is on the equator below sea level. Sea levels are rising. Georgetown is predicted to be underwater in just 6 short years. Always trying to get at you. The queer community in Guyana already faces challenges. Climate disasters make them worse. I met with one trans woman who lives outside of Georgetown. Ian loves to cook chicken curry, and when she's feeling stressed, she likes to sit on the seawall in the back of the village. It's healing for her. She used to live nearby, in a tin structure, safe. But not from flooding, because the rain got at her. The flooding so bad, she lost everything, even her stove. Now, she's forced to live in a room at the front of the village on the street. The slightest breeze rattling the door makes her nervous because she's afraid someone is going to come in and attack her, like they did to her trans sister, a sex worker like herself, murdered. The organization, Guyana Trans United, just got a piece of land, and eventually Ian will have the option of living there, growing her own food. For now, she continues to go to work each night, saving up for a new stove. Guyana's constitution does not provide rights for queer folks like Ian, but it does specifically state citizens have the right to a healthy environment. Due to its untouched forests, Guyana has long been a global leader in combating climate change. But things are kind of weird lately. ExxonMobil found oil off its shores 5 years ago, like a ton of oil. So much that Guyana is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I couldn't go anywhere without seeing all the sand piles for all the construction that's happening. They even built a hardback cafe. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guyana years ago, and all this development was wild to see. There's no denying that ExxonMobil has created more jobs. In fact, some queer folks I know have benefited from the stable employment they offer. Others are worried, like Maev, who goes to a monthly protest against ExxonMobil. And when she looks around Georgetown, she sees less trees, more waste, too. Some of ExxonMobil's waste goes to this sanitary landfill, which uses an innovative Japanese method to curb methane emissions. Rowena she's been the environmental manager for the past 6 years. She told me people tend to think of the landfill as a place of death, garbage everywhere. Yet scattered around are seeds from food scraps. Sometimes Rowena will stumble upon a watermelon or a pumpkin. Life everywhere when the landfill is functioning the way it should. But as a queer woman managing a team mostly of men, it's been hard for Rowena. There's been nasty rumors about her and her girlfriend, attempts to get her fired. Despite that, she still gets up at 4 a.m. every day, making sure the landfill is doing its job. The more I reported on the queer community in Guyana, the more I kept seeing how they're emerging as leaders in the growing environmental movement, despite the uphill battle. Joel on the left, he is the founder of SASAD, an LGBTQ organization that has been laying the groundwork for the past 20 years to strike down those discriminatory laws. They're about to gather data on how climate affects the queer community so they don't get left behind. And when I asked him what the environmental movement can learn from the LGBTQ movement, the first word he said was persistence. Sherlina on the right, she's a queer woman and citizen on a lawsuit against Exxon. She is also the co-founder of the Green Heart movement. And she said something similar, that despite the hostile environment, the queer community finds ways to be resourceful, sometimes simply surviving, other times thriving, always finding joy. And as the climate breaks down, creating another kind of hostile environment, more and more people are going to be forced out of their comfort zone, needing to adapt, like the queer community has always done and continues to do. That last Saturday I was in Guyana, I attended a painting event at the Botanical Gardens. It was hosted by a group that works at the intersection of gender and environmental justice. Maya was there, so was her girlfriend. I saw how relaxed they were, how at ease they were with one another in this space that was so welcoming. At one point, Mayev's girlfriend rested her head on her shoulder, the chittering of the kiskadee birds above them. Human rights and climate justice go hand in hand. Guyana makes this obvious. The ability to freely love who you love in a natural world that isn't trying to get at you, both are equally worth fighting for. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all. My name is Maya Reed, and this summer I traveled to the world's largest refugee camp to report on access to diabetes care for Rohingya refugees living in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. So for some background on the Rohingya refugee crisis, the Rohingya are an ethnic minority group from Myanmar that has faced decades of persecution. But the majority of people in the camps, a camp of 1 million, came in 2017 after increasing violence and ethnic cleansing. The camps are very crowded, and children make up 50% of the population. Now, when most people think of refugee camps, they often think of infectious diseases, hepatitis C and tuberculosis and scabies in this case. And maybe, people might think of food considerations or housing. But I hope today that you'll be able to learn about how non-communicable diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and asthma are also super key for refugees in these sort of settings. There's very limited livelihood opportunities and work opportunities for Rohingya refugees, and currently there's no realistic repatriation options as violence continues to soar in Myanmar. So on the right is a picture of the camp. These stars are the subcamps that I had the opportunity to visit. My reporting activities included interviews with patients at outpatient clinics, in hospitals where they were inpatient, as well as the opportunity to travel to their homes. In different health facilities around the camps, I held interviews with healthcare staff. And then I also had the opportunity to participate in high-level meetings that were in the city of Cox's Bazar in headquarters with folks in the UN system, so the IOM, UNHCR, and the WHO. This is a picture of me. I visited in the summer in the peak of monsoon season. A lot of rain, there were mudslides, and a lot of flooding. This is a very muddy staircase, but it's actually a very nice staircase because it's made out of concrete. So for those who aren't as familiar with diabetes, it's a chronic disease that causes a variety of symptoms. Type 1 diabetics require insulin for life, and type 2 diabetics often require oral medications and sometimes insulin. There's a high rate of diabetes in the camps, with 8.4% of all adults having it, 6.3% of men, and 10.5% of women. Those who are insulin dependent pose major challenges. Insulin needs to be refrigerated, and it takes a lot of management to be able to work with patients on it. There's a high rate of death, hospitalization, and other complications due to inaccess to medications and other issues. And also, as I continued to have conversations with high-level staff, they repeated that there's not enough data and this limits advocacy. So in the US, most patients with diabetes have access to things like blood sugar monitors. The first top picture is a glucometer that attaches to the skin. You can have constant blood glucose monitoring. And the bottom picture are insulin pens that are normally stored in refrigerators and have small, less painful needles to do. Well, how do you store insulin in a refugee camp where the temperature is 90 degrees with 90-degree humidity? The left picture is a hole that a patient dug in his concrete floor, where a little vial of insulin is kept with a metal tin to help to keep it cooler. The middle photo is insulin being kept in water with a plastic bucket over it to also keep it cool. As a note, this is the less ideal version of keeping it. And on the right is Mohammed, who I interviewed with his syringes. So rather than those nicer needles, they require syringes to inject insulin. How do patients get to clinics? Well, transportation is a very huge issue in the camps. All private transportation has been banned. So this includes cars, auto rickshaws, even bicycles. The only option for cars are humanitarian organizations and the government. Most patients who I interviewed walked 1 to 2 hours to get to health facilities. The woman on the right I interviewed in the hospital. She was born with foot deformities, and it took her 3 hours to walk to the hospital, where she was later admitted. There's no centralized ambulance service in the camps. So even in extreme emergencies, it's very hard for patients to access care. So as you can imagine, elderly, disabled, and isolated patients are extra vulnerable to this. So then you might ask, without transportation, how do patients who are weak and can't walk get to the hospital? Well, the bottom photo is a bambulance, and this is a thick piece of bamboo that's strapped with ropes to a chair. And that's how patients get carried by their loved ones. Now, in my conversations with patients and staff, it was reiterated that patients with diabetes have a high level of ostracization and face things like domestic violence in their everyday lives. And this is directly due to their diabetes. This is just one quote, but a woman's husband, he said, "Well, you have diabetes, so my child has a higher chance of getting diabetes." Quite a few times her husband beats her due to this. Her husband was discouraging her to visit the clinic and blaming her to relatives. Her husband never helps her because of social taboos. So overall, though, I want to emphasize that there is huge amounts of care and resilience amongst the community and amongst neighbors. But with staff, they've reinforced that there's a clear need for more community health messaging to build understanding and further that resilience. For patients who are isolated, especially adolescent patients who I spoke with, and young women, peer support groups would be helpful to reduce that isolation. And then furthermore, more safeguards and screening for the key mental health needs. So for my field note, I wrote a very long retelling of my experience meeting a 17-year-old girl in her home as she was in the middle of a diabetic emergency, and I saw firsthand that an ambulance could not come to save her, even though she was dying. But I ended up meeting her again in the hospital as she was improving. My first main article is focused on these overall access issues that are driving diabetic complications and hospitalizations. And then my second article really emerged from more of those conversations around vulnerabilities for women and young girls living with diabetes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope the main takeaway is that healthcare is a human right, and the Rohingya people deserve more attention and more reporting on their plight. Thank you.
Wow, I've never felt so short in my life. My name is Lily Dietz. I am the Flagler College Reporting Fellow. If you don't know where that is, it's St. Augustine, Florida. So yes, it is very cold here for me. Just a little table of contents on what I'll be talking about. Can I go off this? But this is not like a definite thing, so feel free to read if you'd like. Homelessness is one of the world's largest problems. There is no exact number, but it is an estimated 150 million people that are homeless in the world. It's a large number. The reason we can't get a full consensus, though, is because of the time count consensus, which is basically what every country uses to count. Rain or shine, they go out and count the amount of homeless that they can find. It's not definite. Countries like the US don't count people sleeping on couches or in their cars. It's considered housing, just so you guys know. Finland's homeless numbers have decreased by 75%, which since 2008, so around, if I'm doing my math right, 17 years. I'm really bad at math, just so you guys know. I'm going to apologize in advance. But there's still that 25% left. For my deliverables, I did my project as well as my story, and then a thank you to Finland, which is a creative field note as a poem. So it's kind of cool. For my interviews, just so you know, I went to 3 separate NGOs and Finnish organizations that help with homelessness, as well as talked to the previous Minister of Housing. He was there when the initiative was first created, so he's seen it through its entirety. Viveri Irja, she is phenomenal. Being able to walk in and actually see her drop center. It has a library, they do trivia, they do art pieces. She really highlighted on how the homeless feel and how they just want to feel normal. Yasito with Saji Turnen, she was my main source of contact. She actually got me most of my interviews. She also has created the Global Homelessness Summit. That is where I was able to go to for the first 3 days of my reporting. She has gathered people from all over the globe who are working in homelessness as both researchers and developers to speak about their experiences. You learn and grow. They have a whole roundtable where they talk about their issues with homelessness, what their country's facing, the problems that they're having, and people can talk it out and give ideas. So maybe a different country, we had Australia there, they're having issues with drop centers and also with healthcare for the homeless. So we kind of talked that out. And then Marco with Ricadit, it's a housing institution. So they provide affordable housing for the homeless as well as people who are on Social Security, the elderly, and people with drug abuse. He is on the forefront of housing there. He is one of the main landlords. So he really went into exactly the amount of money that the government gives versus how much that they pay, which their housing is $750 roughly, and they only have to pay 30% of that. The government pays the rest, so that's really low. My reporting progress, I began asking for interviews in March, which was a little late, I feel. And a couple interviews did back out last minute, sadly, due to time constraint. But that was kind of the forefront of, I contacted Yacito at the time, and she put me to different people. In April, I really began contacting those interviews for a fine-tuned day because I was leaving literally in May. So I had to make sure I was right down to the exact hour. In May, I left. I stayed at a hostel. Never stayed at a hostel before. Did not realize Finland doesn't really have AC. It was kind of hot. But I will say staying at the hostel was probably the best experience ever. Through being at the hostel, I was able to actually talk to people who are immigrants over, and they are staying at this hostel because it's only $33 a day. And you get housing, not really AC, but you get a place to sleep. You get a kitchen, running water, and they talked about the struggles as an immigrant to not be able to find a job, which has led them to being homeless. To touch on that a little bit, Finnish is not the main quote-unquote language there. It's actually English, but if you cannot speak Finnish, then you're not going to find a high-paying job, if anything, a job. Most of the people who cannot speak Finnish and only speak English or another language can find only factory or as a maid. So really, it's very difficult. There's only so many jobs you can get through that. And then in June, I began writing my deliverables, and then in July, I finished the final edits and submitted the project for publication. Let's see. Yes. So the takeaways. So through this entire process, it became quite evident that with each person I interviewed, who's working specifically on eradicating homelessness, not just like random people I contacted from other countries. Finland's homelessness as a future is really up in the air. Currently, the government is pulling back funding, and that's causing a lot of these NGOs or non-governmental organizations to not be able to pay to help these people. Without the funding, you can't eradicate homelessness. And that's really not due to any political side, because currently it is a political year for them. It's everywhere. So basically the fate of the initiative's success is looking kind of bleak to everyone. There was not really any positive say on what would happen within the next few years, which is really sad. So could other countries adopt it? Maybe. But it's not definite depending on how, in the long run, are they going to cut funding. And that seems to be the thing after a number of years. They're like, oh, 75% is fine. Is it really, though? Because you still have 25% without housing, and those 75% are technically still homeless, but they're living in government housing, but they still either have a drug abuse issue, or they also don't have a job. They're not really able to sustain themselves. I believe it is possible to fully eradicate homelessness, but not within the next 50 years. And I hate to say that as someone who's worked with the homeless since I was 10. It's sad, and being able to walk in there and see people who are homeless struggling hurts your soul. But there's only so much right now that people are willing to do for them. I think that's it. Thanks.
Hi everybody, my name is Srijan. You can call me Sri. I am from Northwestern University in Qatar. It's based in the Middle East, and originally I'm from Nepal. It's a country in South Asia, a small country, a beautiful country. You guys should definitely visit it. Before I start, I want to ask a question. What can $1 get you in this country? Just thinking out loud. Right, like small chocolates, like gummies and everything. But for thousands of women in Nepal at the moment, $1 is what's getting them not just food, not just their children's education, but also rent, clothing, and everything. For most times, less than $1 for years and years. And that is what my project is about, Fair Trade in Nepal, the hidden cost of all of it. Before I start, I want to introduce a few terms that comes with this. Have you been in the street, especially during the winter, and you've seen like woolen caps, gloves, like jackets, like a lot of colorful jackets that you see made out of wool. So a lot of these things they are produced in countries like Nepal, countries in the global south. And these are the women behind those fabric. These are women who are often unemployed, who are often migrants from other parts of the capital itself, are often single women, are often very vulnerable, like ethnic minorities in the capital. So, in order to give them jobs in 2006, agreement was made between the European Union, the states, and Nepal called Fair Trade Initiatives, which is basically initiatives through which you not only provide business opportunities to local communities, but also make sure that they're paid well, that they're like more sustainable, and at the end of the day, everything is like fair in this case. Because something that they get $1 for in Nepal is sold for $15, $20, $30 out in the world. So that was the agreement that was made in 2006. But according to the reporting that I was able to do during the summer, that hasn't been the case for the past 2 decades. So at first, let me introduce the different groups that are involved in this particular project and tell you more about what this is about. So at the top, you can see 6 women who are from this place called Bhaktapur. These are ethnic people of the land. Later, a lot of people migrated and they were pushed away to the suburbs of these areas. These are the women who are paid the lowest. And here are the reasonings that people give. It's not only that this trade is less and their place is far from where the main commerce happens, but it's also that a lot of them have no other job but this. So a lot of people from the capital, they come to these women, especially men who supply these things to the West. They come and to their face, they say, hey, like you don't have anything else to do, you don't have any other skills, so this is your job. That's narrative 1. Secondly, you'll see group over here. These are fair trade groups. So even though the agreement was made and a lot of exploitation is done, there is some form of ethicalness that is there when it comes to certain companies. This is an example of what contrast it can look like when it comes to working spaces. So most of the working spaces are very hot, they're very cramped, they're very isolating in nature. Like, a lot of people, they're just there, the machines are like running, the safeties aren't there. So when you contrast these 2 pictures, you can already see like what kind of stuff is there. Now, before I start delving into more of the specificities of this project, I want to move a little into why this story. That little kid is me, that's my mother. When I was small, my mom was also a migrant in the capital. She lost her husband, and at that time, like things were tough. So the way I was introduced to this whole story of exploitation was seeing through my mother seeing my mother struggle through all the years. In a sense that she was also paid less than $1 for most of her life, and that's how she raised like the 4 of us in this case. Sadly, like no matter how much these initiatives have gone out there and talked about this, there's little to no reporting in this issue, which led me to pitch this idea over here and do this story. I would like to play a small video, which is about small snippets of the interviews that I took during the time and what the conditions look like.
चाहिँ एउटा महिलाले अब बुढो छैन भने जस्तो होइन मान्छेले हेप्छन् अब पैसा माग्दा पनि आज भन्यो भोलि भन्यो पर्सि भन्यो त्यस्तै हो भाउ एउटा यो यतिकै हेड बुन्दा चाहिँ खासै 50 रुपैयाँ मात्र पाइन्छ जेला त्यही कहिले कहाँ दिक्क लाग्छ के आफूले लगानी गर्न नसक्ने अनि जेला पनि छैन त्यस्तै यो
यो अर्डर आछ है यति अर्डर आछ यो पिस भ्याउनु पर्छ चाहिँ भन्नुहुन्छ तर हामीलाई त्यो कहाँ जान्छ यो कहाँ बिक्छ हामीले त्यस्तो केही पनि आइडिया हुँदैन हामीलाई भन्नु पनि हुँदैन हामीले सोध्ने कुरा पनि भएन
चामल अहिले हामी पहिला 10 वर्ष अगाडि 18 रुपैयाँ 20 रुपैयाँमा किनेर खान्थ्यो त्यो चामल अहिले 40 रुपैयाँ 50 रुपैयाँ पर्छ तर हाम्रो कामदारको जालामा त्यति फरक चाहिँ परेको छैन के
यो टोपी एउटा बनाउनलाई 2 घण्टा लाग्छ कि यो 2 घण्टा लाग्छ यो हैन अरु यसमा रेट नि पुगेको छैन कि अब हामीलाई दिने नि 50 रुपैयाँ दिन्छ हैन हामीले कति दिने बुन्ने मान्छेलाई हो कि हैन
That was a small clip of the different kind of demographics that are involved in here. The first demographic that you'd see over there are migrants from this place called Rukum, which is West Nepal, one of the most remote places there. The women in that particular story, they were in the capital for almost 20 years and they were still earning less than $1. So those were the extent of the interviews. To make this project in its entirety, like, you know, relevant in the current discourse, there were 3 layers of investigation that I did. So I interviewed a bunch of retailers from the main streets where a lot of these things are sold, but also the middlemen who, you know, like negotiate with the Western companies. According to them, like, you know, they often blame the market. There's like, hey, like, we're getting offered so less in the first place, so what can we do in this case? We need the economy. In terms of workers, like, you know, most of them are migrants, most of them are minorities in this case. And there have been cases of people not getting their money for years and years, that too being very little money. At the end is fair trade groups. These are groups that are like initiatives that are trying to at least implement somewhat of what's happening, but at the same time, because the market and the prices are so low, these businesses are failing as well. So this project will compile of 2 things: an investigation into, you know, these workers and who are the exploiters in this case, and secondly, in terms of like what that system as a whole looks like through a documentary. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Hi, everybody. That's it. Oh, I'm holding it upside down. That's on me. Yeah. Hi. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Una Wilson, and I am actually here as a reporting fellow from last year's campus consortium. My project was delayed for a year due to some travel complications. So since we're short on time and technically already a year overdue, let's get digging. So before I jump into more of the specifics, the nitty-gritty of my projects, I want to get a bit of context going on what's at stake and why this reporting project matters. So by now we are all aware of climate change, I hope, and its deleterious effects on human and ecological well-being. And amid growing concerns around climate change, something else is growing too, and fast, and that is our cities. So worldwide, our largest cities are getting bigger and bigger. And nearly 56% of the global population lives in cities today, and that is expected to increase nearly 70% by 2050. Cities are great. I live in New York. But the environmental impacts of mass urbanization are numerous. I won't read them aloud because, again, we're pressed on time. But a few to note, habitat loss certainly is a big one. The heat island effect, which is where cities or urban areas are hotter because there's less trees to cool things down and more buildings and asphalt. Flooding, a huge one, especially in cities that we've seen recently being impacted by hurricanes, and waste management. So The climate crisis is urgent, and especially in urban areas, this demands a reduction in fossil fuel emissions, agriculture, and food systems that can be sustainable, so that we can reduce, avoid, and remove greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the negative biogeophysical and biogeochemical effects on the climate. The challenge is how to sustainably provide food for a world of roughly 9 billion people in 2050, with 6.5 billion of those people living in urban areas without exacerbating the climate crisis. And this is where community gardens come in. So the USDA defines community gardens as collaborative projects on shared open spaces where participants share in the maintenance and products of the garden. They provide nutritious food to local residents, and they often reach those located in food deserts or those who lack access to affordable produce. They help lower urban heat indexes, enhance regional biodiversity, and have been shown to improve the health and well-being of their participants. And don't let the word community fool you into thinking small. In the past decade, we'd seen a 44% increase in the total number of community gardens in the 100 largest cities in the United States. But despite their many benefits, community gardens are only just rising into the limelight of urban infrastructure and planning and receiving governmental support. Many of these gardens start really small, by just a handful of citizens passionate about sowing those seeds of strength and longevity. But I believe that we can learn something vital for them. And I believe that we can take these lessons from their initiatives and apply them in other communities, maybe even your own. So let's meet our players of the reporting project that I did. And where we will find them is Mexico City, the largest metropolitan hub in North America. There it is. So urban gardening is actually not new to Mexico City. 500 years ago, Mexico City would have been right in the center of Lake Texcoco, where the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan floated. There's a little diagram. And to build their city outwards, the Aztecs actually utilized a technique called the chinampas. And these are floating gardens that they used to not only build out their urban infrastructure, but also cultivate crops. The mud and manure that they used was really nutrient dense, and so it allowed for really efficient crop production, not only in terms of space, but also nutrient density. Unfortunately, neither the Aztec Empire nor their floating gardens lived past the mid-16th century, thanks to the Spanish invasion. And in 1521, the Spanish destroyed Tenochtitlan and drained the valley's lakes to make land available for terrestrial agriculture. And it was on top of those ruins of Tenochtitlan that the Spanish laid the foundation for Mexico City. So back to the present day, where community gardens are now blooming like modern-day chinampas in Mexico City. So I visited around 20 different gardens in Mexico City to catalog this kind of revitalization of community gardening and urban agriculture in a place where its roots run very deep. It's home to officially 21 community gardens, but there are hundreds more that I found. Oh, that's an interesting format on that. Anyways, so I wanted to share some of those gardens with you with the remaining time that I have. So this is Huerto Tlatelolco. It's run by Gabriela Vargas. She's right down in the corner. This garden was founded in 2012. Gabriela is a member of a group called the Sembradores Urbanos, or the Urban Seed Planters. And she's one of 3 women. The organization was started in 2001. There's nothing special about these women other than that they really were passionate about urban gardening and bringing produce to their communities. Gabriela's garden is really special. She has a seed bank, a duck, and she also implemented a local composting program where she provides incentives for community members to bring their compost, and they get volunteer hours in exchange to bring home produce. So it's this very cyclical, not diminishing, but I guess increasing returns policy that she has. Huerto Romita was the first community garden founded under the Sembradores Urbanos. Right now it is run by Nayeli Reel. And she also has a small kitchen in her urban garden space where they perform cooking classes with their culinary intern. And then Phoenix Farms is a very interesting garden because they use mainly private funding. Lily Foster, the owner, she turned her garden space into a commercial business. So she takes on urban agriculture projects with private funding and opens them to the public. Really unique approach. And then Huerto Roma Verde, I'm actually not going to talk that much about them because it was just a really, really cool space. But Pablo, he wasn't part of the Sembradores Urbanos, but their artwork and their mural work and all of their buildings and infrastructure was just stunning. And I wanted to conclude with a quote from Nayeli, who runs the Huerto Romita. She said, "We, Huerto Romita, are already at the heart, the roots of the city here, and now we spread them in the community, in the city. Now we have the opportunity to spread our knowledge, like little seeds, to people everywhere. It's almost like we are the Chinampas, floating gardens all over the world."
Hello? 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 Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry. Oh, that's okay. I guess I could have used that one too, but. Okay. So now it is time for the Q&A section. So while you guys are all thinking about your questions, you can think on them, you can sit on them. I'm going to ask our panelists first if you guys have any questions for each other. It's okay if you do not. So, are there any questions? Emma, thank you so much. Oh, wait. I'm going to give you the mic, and you're going to stand up. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see. I've written down multiple questions, so let me think, which one am I going to choose? But yeah, I'm Emma. It was wonderful to hear all of your presentations and your work. Maya, I have a question for you about yours. And this is just a lack of knowledge on my part, but can you say more about who the bodies are that are governing these camps and these health centers? And I know you mentioned you were at some kind of like UN system meeting, so I'm assuming there's like some UN influence there, but what are the groups that are actually responsible for implementing proper healthcare, and like why are they failing so badly? So.
Is it on? You can hear me? Okay, fantastic. That's such a great question because it is a very complicated mix of different humanitarian actors. There are multiple UN organizations there providing different types of services, like I had mentioned, UNHCR. The IOM does their own sort of implementation of healthcare work. The WHO is normally like a more consulting type of body that does a lot of scientific studies and does a lot of sort of advisory work. UNHCR manages a lot of protection. I wouldn't say the healthcare is failing as much as I would say there's massive, massive cuts in funding. I know we all know that there's massive, humanitarian crises around the world. Funding for the health sector has been cut by over 50% in the past years. And then again, there's private NGOs. So there's like a Turkish hospital, there's Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, there's Care International. It's very complicated. And then that map that I had shown, all those subcamps are generally run by different organizations based off of the camps. And the residents have to go to the health facilities within that camp. So it's a bit limiting, but thank you for the question. Would love to talk to you more about it.
Kim.
Hello, hi, my name's Kim. Your presentations are wonderful. I have a question for Celeste and Maya. I was really struck by how you guys managed to talk to these vulnerable groups and gain their trust and got so much rich narrative details from probably interviewing with them. So I'm as a reporter, I'm curious, how did you manage to find these people, especially assuming that you guys are perhaps not from the region, or maybe you guys are, but how did you manage to find these people and gain their trust? Are there any takeaways for reporters when it comes to like working with these vulnerable groups and being respectful to them?
Yeah, I'll start. It took a long time. So I had said I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guyana. So I had already had some of these relationships, and I actually have to confess I started reporting on this last summer. And yeah, it just took a really long time, and I kind of just one by one started with these connections I had and kind of went from there. And I think even before I knew I still needed more access, and I knew that Guyana was a place where if I showed up and I kept showing up, then I knew that I would be able to gain access. But I do want to tell you about a mistake of mine, because I think this is a good lesson. I feel like the connector person is the most important person to find in reporting. And I had that person actually kind of early on. I had met someone who was like, here, you should talk to Vidya. He knows everyone. And I was like, great. And so I talked to Vidya, but I asked him the wrong questions. I realized that I just didn't ask him I didn't ask the right questions. And so he kind of fell in the back of my reporting priorities. And so when I went there to Guyana, I met with him, but on the very last day. And when I met with him on the very last day, I was like, oh, I should have met with you way earlier, because he actually had access to this one organization that I had been trying to get access for months. Now I have it because I took the time, but I should have met with him earlier. So finding that connected person and early on, and listening to when people say you need to talk to this person, you need to talk to this person, and asking the right questions is really important. But short answer, it took a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the question. I think building trust is so important, especially when speaking with vulnerable communities. I had really fantastic connections and advice. I did a lot of pre-reporting. Access to the camp was facilitated through an NGO. With regards to building trust, some few things is learning a little bit of the language. I'd say that's just a start. Know the greeting, assalamu alaikum, know how to say thank you, shukriya. Even those small things, when I would start a conversation, just immediate smiles, immediate a bit of more comfort. I was really lucky in that I worked with translators who were actually staff at the clinics or the hospitals, who had already had rapport with the patients, and that was already sort of a baseline level of trust. And then I will say the absolute best piece of advice that I'd ever had was when I spoke with a mental health advisor in a Zoom call before going. And she said, your questions are really great, but when you're talking about mental health, don't say the word mental health. Don't say the word depression. Don't say the word sadness. Say the question, since you've been diagnosed and since you've been getting treatment, how have things been with your friends and family? And that question immediately brought out so many stories, so much just pouring out of connection and shared humanity. And I think it's a balance between having that objective sort of journalism space and voice, and then also just connecting with people on a human level, and maybe even sharing a little bit about yourself beforehand too. Thanks.
Okay. Here, Jaquel, and then Ananya will do you too. I have one request that I should have said earlier, but when you stand up and say your name, can you also say what school you're from? Thank you.
Absolutely. Hello, nice to meet everybody. I feel I'm talking really loud, so I'm going to move away. I'm Jaquel Spearman from Houston-Tilson University in Austin, Texas. I have wrote questions for everybody, but I'll ask two in specific. First, Lily, You mentioned the Global Summit. Is there any shared budget that they work together with to attack homelessness?
So there is not. The representatives are all from different organizations, either through the country or as an NGO organization. Wow, my southern accent really just came out, so sorry. That was like really southern. And they are all researchers for their own organizations that have a connection with Yacito specifically, or they've written books of research that has partnered with other organizations specifically.
Just a follow-up question to that, I guess. So how would you, if I don't know how long you were there, but how would you say coming together has, I guess, work in the benefit of improving homelessness?
I was there for 2.5 weeks. Coming together, all of the organizations in some way work together, whether it's a certain organization tells someone to go to a different one because they're more specifically organized for that. Specifically with like Viveri, they're with immigrants and they're also with people with drug abuse. As well with Yacito, it's more for just in general homelessness. I have to say all the organizations being able to work together and come to a specific location and meet and talk about their issues or their questions has definitely helped in the long run. I mean, you see the 75%. That is a crazy amount no one has ever seen. And it's because they're able to work together and they're able to help each other with getting grants for funding. They also work with the government in some sort of way to make that sort of connection to really hone in how to help people.
Thank you. Yeah. And Una, how do I say it correctly? Okay, yes. I just want to make sure I'm saying this so I'm not saying it wrong. How can the average person learn and educate themselves about gardening so they can help their communities around them to participate?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. Probably one of my favorite questions because I love gardening. I would say that almost every place has a gardening or a green space, and I think that I always benefit from learning by doing. So, a Google search, look up community gardens near me, go there, meet those people. I've never met a really angry person at a community garden. They're generally very welcoming. But then I'll also say I'm a recent college graduate, and in my job and fellowship applications, I've been learning a lot about environmental policy. And actually through that research, I guess it's the USDA, there are so many grants and educational materials available through the US government. I'm not sure about other governments, and it goes from local to national. They have pamphlets, booklets. If you want to start a community garden, they'll give you a step-by-step of like how to get that funding and what tools and materials you would need. And then also I would say, if you want to start a garden, just start with one pot and then go from there.
Nice. Any recommendations?
On like plants?
Yes.
You really can't kill a pothos. Okay. Everybody says that, but like I've had one for 5 years. I would say start there. And basil. Basil's great. You can eat it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Hi guys, I'm Ananya and I'm representing the University of Richmond. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So this is a question for all of you guys really because I was moved by all of your presentations. So I feel like in journalism, especially in my classes, they're like objectivity is very important and keeping like a distance between you and your sources. You can't really give them favors, and that was something my mentor had told me too from the fellowship. But I feel like Norah, you mentioned like you got really close with your sources and all of you guys really connected with your sources. That's how all these stories were produced, I feel like. So I'm just curious. And also, Shri, you said like you have this personal experience because of your mother as well. So I'm curious, were those boundaries crossed? Like, did you approach this as a journalist, as a storyteller? How did you guys get to these stories? And feel free for anyone to answer.
I can start on this one. Am I audible? For me, I think that was a very huge question before I started my reporting itself, because not only was it a story about my mother, but also like the whole connection. Given that I used to work in the same space, like it became a personal matter as well, right? So for me, I think one step by which I was trying to get away of that not just bias but also the subjective angle that comes into it is through diversifying the sources itself. So I was trying to make sure that the sources that I interviewed were farther in demographic when it comes to my mother or the people that I was associated with, in order to verify certain hypotheses and to know if they were true or not. But also in terms of like getting that vulnerability, for me it's, and this is something that I practice in other things that I do in journalism as well, and language really helps on this one, right? Is not only like pulling out a camera 10 minutes or 20 minutes into the interview, or sometimes even an hour into the interview, right? When it's like vulnerable communities who share like question, like answers of death and divorces and poverty and all of this, like I think that vulnerability comes when you live that lifestyle for a while. So rather than having the interview on the first day, to schedule it over the weekend and having it on the third day brings out much more of that vulnerability. Because at first, especially in my project, like me as a man going to these spaces which is like fully of women, and there are cases of like violations and harassment and all of that, like in order to build that trust itself, I had to live with them for a few days in order to bring that out. So I think in that case, like you need that vulnerability through exposure that comes.
I think I'll also add that I think that having not cultivated a relationship with my sources in that way, my reporting would have been very different, because I'm coming in from a very outsider perspective, where what I know is from what I've read, what I've like done my research on, but it's not, I haven't lived and like had this like intimate relationship with this place in and of itself. And so it's by, cultivating a relationship with my sources where they feel comfortable to take me with them when they're going to go hang out with their friends, or taking me with them to these different places, is a way in which I was able to not just do my reporting from like a American-centric or Western-centric lens. That's what I have. Like, that's what I grew up, like, that's the perspective I bring to the table, but that's not the perspective I want to have in my reporting, because that's not objective either. And so I think that by actually cultivating a relationship with my sources is the way I'm actually able to make my reporting more objective, because I'm not just coming at it from my perspective, but actually able to understand where they're coming from.
I guess I'll touch a little bit on this. So going into this, I had a deep understanding of homelessness, not only through friends who had been homeless, but also through a family member. So I kind of understood the mindset of people who are homeless. And when you go into an organization, you have to be objective in the way of how certain things work. But also and at least in my sense, I had to make a connection to be able to get in. With these places, they're not easy to trust. And a lot of the times outsiders are not allowed in for safety reasons. I could not take any photos of people's faces. I was not permitted to talk to any of the homeless specifically. And also I had to keep names out of all of my stories for, one, safety reasons on their amount, especially some people with domestic violence, and two, just for, if they end up getting a job, they don't want them to know their situation, sort of thing. So being able to put myself in a mindset of, I care for these people's livelihoods, but also I need to be objective in a way of, I need to tell a story. Did I think that my story would go the way it did and have to say that I don't think that the situation's working well? No. That's just me being objective. And every single person I talk to, they're like, I want you to say it how you see it. If you don't think that Finland's initiative is going to work and it will fail, say it. It needs to be said. And having that relationship through phone call and email with a lot of these people, I feel like they opened up a lot more than they did to other people. We had personal talks. I was there for 3+ hours drinking coffee with one person before she was able to fully open up and talk about her struggles running an organization and the amount of cut in funding, to the point that she almost broke down into tears because she was so stressed. And her hair was falling out and she was not eating well. So really it's like you need, and at least in certain senses, to build a connection to understand the full severity of a situation, but you need to also understand you're there for a job. Like, you're not there to write a story that is only one-sided. It needs to be sided with everyone.
Great, thank you. Next, Josiah, I see you, and then you can just hand it right over afterwards.
Hi, my name is Josiah. I'm from Westchester Community College in New York. My question is for Shri. So I'm from a really hot country, and I remember my first winter in the US. It was terrible, and I wore beanies every single day, and those wool hats and stuff. And I love your story about your mom. And so my question is, do you see like a way forward in terms of like, obviously exploitation isn't good, and do you see like a way forward where they can like start their own business, where they can work for themselves, like seeing that they have such a community amongst themselves?
So that's another angle of the entire story, in a sense that the first angle talks about the whole exploitation chain, like where it starts, who are the players, and like who is getting how much benefit in this case, right? There's an entirely different investigation that comes into the play in the middle of the article and the documentary, which focuses on the existing fair trade groups that already exist. So a lot of companies that often sell these things, they label themselves as fair trade even though they're not. So the whole question doesn't only become a question of accountability, so of a question of exploitation, but also a question of accountability. Because as long as Western companies also don't know that these things aren't like fair trade, that's where the whole exploitation persists. So I think like accountability becomes number one in this case. But secondly, in terms of like initiatives whereby like these people start their own businesses and stuff, like despite the existing limitations, because with that money there is no chance any business is being formed of that scale, right? There are cases, especially not in the capital, surprisingly, but in the rural areas more, where the communities are small and they're able to integrate their like art more. So these are communities where like fair trade organizations did camps for almost like 6 to 7 months, and then like made sure that after they taught the skills to these women, they would be able to invest and like get their own stuff. So for a lot of women living in these rural landscapes, like even just the fact that they're going to an office in idea would change a lot of things within the thing. But in the capital itself, because it's such a tough market and there isn't much communication there, accountability becomes like the factor for exploitation here.
One more question for Celeste. You said that Trans United, they obtained some land. Is there like, are they going to build like a complex, or like, can you like expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I think, well, not really. I think the details are still kind of to be determined. But yeah, I think the idea is that, that they have a piece of land that, like I kind of said, trans folks can come live on. And I don't think they're going to build a complex. They don't get a lot of money. They're one of the organizations in Guyana that has had a hard time getting funding for many different reasons. But yeah, so details are still kind of to be determined, but they're kind of just starting with this piece of land. And the idea is that, that it will be a place where they can kind of control their own food security in a time when food insecurity is pretty bad.
Hello, my name is Nia. I'm representing Hampton University, but I currently go to University of Illinois. I have a question for Maya and for Una. So for Maya, do most of the people have type 1 or type 2 diabetes? And if they have type 2, is that like how they're eating while they're in the refugee camps, or like what causes that? And then for Una, how are they doing the urban gardening? So I know in some places like New York, they've done like terrace gardening or vertical gardening. Is it like that in Mexico City as well, or different types, or like traditional gardening? So, yeah.
That is a great question. And I think my first answer is there's just not enough research into some of the drivers for diabetes, as well as the direct numbers. But I would say the majority is type 2 because the majority of diabetes worldwide is type 2. There's a lot of systemic factors to that, one being the intense amount of stress and just stress on the body repeatedly. Food is another major factor that I wish I had had more time to talk about, just in terms of livelihood. So one thing that also kept coming up in my conversations with people were Rohingya refugees get $10 US per month from the WFP, so the World Food Program, to access food. And so the majority of people need to eat rice 3 times a day. And doctors will tell patients with diabetes, you should take bread in the morning and the evening because it has a lower glycemic index and it's better for you. And patients will say, well, rice is cheaper. I don't have enough money. I can't work, and therefore I have to take rice. There's a lot of general factors. There's a lot of insecurity in the camp, so a lot of people can't leave their homes as much. So that limits, access to physical exercise and things like that. So it's really multifaceted, but thanks so much for the question.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of gardening in Mexico City, it's really a multifaceted approach. So there are no 2 gardens alike. Phoenix Farms, run by Lily Foster, the commercial urban agriculture project that she started, she actually does a lot of partnerships with apartment buildings. And so they'll pay her to come and do an urban agriculture project on the roof. And it betters their whole apartment building. And then she takes that money and she uses it to pay employees. And I wish I had time to say this during my presentation, but she really emphasized that to make community gardening and urban agriculture sustainable, you have to give people incentives to do it in a lot of cases. And so for her, that has been by hiring employees, and she does that through doing, terrace spaces, rooftop spaces, and then a lot of her extra money she puts towards other land projects, like on the physical earth, not up in the sky. And she'll donate those actually because in the city center, it's pretty affluent, but as you get more rural in the metropolitan area, there's a lot more poverty. And so she builds gardens out in those areas. And then a lot of the other garden spaces that weren't private, like publicly funded ones or ones that were a collaboration between public and private entities. There was a huge earthquake in Mexico City, I believe in 1980. I could be very wrong on that. But it leveled a lot of the city. And so actually, I think maybe 4 or 5 of the gardens I encountered were built on the ruins of lots that were leveled because of that earthquake. And it was really interesting to see how different people use the bits of concrete or trash or pieces of rebar to create art or, beds for their gardens. So, yeah, thank you for the question.
All right, folks, we probably have time for one more question. So who has, Katerina, you have a really good question? The last one? Awesome.
Hello, my name is Katerina, and I'm from San Diego State University. So my question's for Shriyan. I really loved your story, and especially I was really impressed by your photography and the visuals that you had for your story. And I was really curious if you went into your project knowing what kind of visuals you wanted, or did they happen organically? Did you have to plan ahead for those because they were just really well compositioned and very colorful, and I feel like they added so much to it. So that was my question.
First, thank you. I really appreciate it. At first, there were a few shots that I had always envisioned. So, there were 2 groups. One, the initial one with a small circle. So that was already planned. I was okay, this is a small space. I need to make sure how to use the small space in terms of light, in terms of the tripod, the small space and everything. So at that time, I had certain idea of what to do. But the scenes that you see in the factory I wasn't allowed to take those shots, so I sneaked into a factory in order to take those shots. Because the main manufacturers who own this, they often refused interviews. They often didn't let any journalists around the area, often through like not replying or through intimidation that comes from these people, right? Because these are also very powerful, very rich people in the area. So for me, like the shots that were taken in the factory were actually on the spot, because I was hiding my camera here at first, and then later, like, you know, after the bosses left, like, I had to quickly set up everything and shoot, and then ask the consent from the factory workers themselves and not the main person in order to do this. So yeah, it was very spontaneous in a sense that a lot of it was unexpected, because, you know, every time I used to go to a factory, they're like, no, you can't come there. So I just sneaked in.
Thank you.
All right, let's give it up for our entire human rights panel. You guys did great.